Hello everyone, and welcome to the final installment of the Endora trilogy. If you haven't seen the first two videos, you know how it goes. There's the card in the upper right corner and there's the link in the description. What you're looking at right now is a perfectly loopable 2-minute animation that was the final outcome of the process that you're about to see. It was my contribution to a collaboration between myself and my friend Filip, the composer from Ghelfi music. If you want to see and hear the whole thing, again, card and description. It's on their channel. It's been tedious. The whole process, I mean. As I've mentioned before, this was the first time that I created a piece from scratch, starting with photo manipulation and finishing up with an animation. I do this for fun, but after this experience, I have nothing but respect and admiration for the people who do big pieces like this for a living. I chopped the process in 2-hour sessions on average, sometimes once, sometimes twice per day. I cannot imagine doing something like this as a 9-to-5 job. Despite being in a flow state while working in Photoshop or After Effects, after about an hour and a half I can sense my optic nerve tensing up. It's easy to overdo it if you lose yourself in the moment. I did it a few times and it's not without consequences. Headache, eyes burn, blurred vision, sore shoulders, tiredness, inability to fall asleep. I've experienced it all. The whole point behind this monologue is that you need to find a way to take frequent breaks. Take care of your health, I guess. If you need something to take away from this video, let this be it. Now, before we move on to the good stuff, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel if photo manipulation and animation are among your interests. Of course, if you have something to say, the comment section is always open. Crack those fingers and start typing. I just gotta say, if you're a subscriber, you seriously rock. But you know that already, don't you? Alright, let's move on. As usual, the first thing I did was import the Photoshop file into After Effects and scaled everything down to 50% to fit the 1080p, since I do all my artwork in 4K. But before I moved on to the actual animation, I tried recreating the look that I achieved in Camera Raw filter in Photoshop by using multiple lumetri color filters in Adobe After Effects and playing around with blending modes and opacity to get the closest match. But since the night scene was an important part of the animation, I used moonlight, a standard Photoshop LUT, as it was perfect for it. The next thing I wanted to take care of was the smoke coming out of the engine exhaust, since I wasn't sure how to approach it. Finally, I used ripple and turbulent displace effects in different variations for each individual smoke to create the desired movement. Now, making the smoke movement loopable from such a random set of effects is easy. Let me show you. Once I was happy with how it looked, I pre-comped all the smoke layers into single composition and put them back into screen mode to remove the black background. Then I made the composition longer by 10 seconds, and that's where the magic starts. I split the composition into 2 separate layers, moved the upper duplicate to the first frame and the one below it to the last frame. That way I created a continuous movement of the smoke. The only thing left to do was to create a fade between the two. One might think that the best way to create a fade is to oppose the opacity keyframes at the same frame, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Offsetting them by a few seconds actually works much better. Let the layer that needs to fade out run a few seconds later than the one that fades in. The same trick was applied to the waterfall later on in the video. I hope this was clear enough. If you need further explanation, let me know in the comments. I'm sorry for accidentally skipping this part in the recording, but the way I moved the city was just a matter of creating a seemingly random position curve with the matching first and last frames. The only thing that you need to pay attention to when animating a matching movement is the direction that an object is moving in needs to match at the beginning and at the end of the loop. The easiest thing to do next was to animate all the balloons and blimps. I just created some simple movements by keyframing the position. I first had the idea to make every layer 3D in order to move the ones that need to fly in and out of the frame in actual Z-space. But I realized that it wasn't needed because I could do it equally efficiently just by using scale for the 2 air vehicles that needed to move that way. That gave me one less axis to worry about. The two vehicles moving through depth just needed some additional effects in order to further enhance the illusion of movement. So I keyframed curves to match contrast and exposure to the scene. And just for some additional interest, I made the balloons going from left to right in the city move in a non-linear fashion. It was time to move on to animating the goddess Endora. I pre-comped all the elements of the character into a single composition, for the sake of clarity. For starters, I just moved the pre-comp up and down in 3-second increments and applied easy ease on the keyframes. That created the typical illusion of levitating. I wanted to make the shield and the blades rotate at some point in the animation, in opposite directions from one another, so I did that at a 10-second mark or so and moved on to animating the head and the arms. I made the head bob up and down and created a rotation in shoulders, shoulder pads and elbows in 3-second increments to match the levitation, and applied easy ease on them. To make the movement more organic, I offset the keyframes by 2 or 3 frames so that the movement of the head and the shoulders is running later than the levitation and the elbows even later than the shoulders. I had the idea to use a puppet pin tool to expand and contract her torso to create the illusion of breathing, but I quickly ditched it since it didn't look quite right and I couldn't mess with it too much because the deadline was approaching. It looked promising at that stage, but I realized that the city was moving a bit too much, so I narrowed the position curve and it was time to move on to creating the waterfall. To make the waterfall actually fall, I used 2 different still shots of actual waterfalls, masked them out, feathered the masks and used the same trick to make them loop as I did for the smoke composition. In retrospect, I should have used only 1 waterfall video instead of 2. It was too late when I realized that the movement of the water was almost invisible in the final render, but it is what it is. We all make mistakes and this one wasn't so obvious, so I'm not too mad about it. The time has finally come to create the loops and transitions. I copied the animation 4 times and creating the intro loop was as easy as turning off the Endora composition. Loop 1 done. The transition between day and night, however, was a bit more tricky. Not because the scene was supposed to turn dark when the Endora appears, but because I didn't know how to make her appear. You'll realize that I had multiple ideas, like her appearing from a vortex, but I eventually decided to just go with simple turbulent displacement and good old opacity. I added some extra glow on the shield and the gem in her crown for some additional interest, and then I played a little more with colors because I wanted for the glow to be more prominent, but I'm not sure if I succeeded in that endeavor. However, I decided to move on anyway as I was losing too much time already. For the second loop, the night scene, I downloaded some explosion assets from vdz.com, and the most tedious part of the whole process began, masking them all out to match the scene. Because the city was a single layer, I couldn't just put them between the layers. It took me a while, but it looked good. I put them into screen blending mode and applied some additional glow to give it some extra liveliness. And it was finally time to move on to the final transition. In this bit, I needed to return the scene back to daytime, which was as easy as fading out the adjustment layers. But what gave me more trouble than I hoped was Endora's ascension. I knew that I wanted to use glow to create the bloom, but I just couldn't make it work for quite some time. I finally added the exposure effect, and that kinda worked. Even though I still wasn't happy with the outcome, after so many hours of work, I was so done with it. When I look at it now, I see what I could have done differently. But from this perspective, I'm happy with what I've achieved in this process. And most importantly, I'm happy with my personal growth, knowing that I finally got to a point where I can create something like this from scratch. Therefore, if anything, let this be my bit of inspiration for you. Never stop dreaming and never stop learning. So, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And consider subscribing to my channel if you want to see more photo manipulation and animation processes like this. Take care of yourselves. This is Crafty, and I bid you farewell.